Okay, we're back. And I got a shelf. If you saw my last video, I now have a shelf. Making big moves. Trying to be a YouTuber or whatever. Okay, so I'm going all in on Bitcoin. And by all in, I mean I'm going to be putting a large percentage of my income into Bitcoin for the foreseeable future. This has come after about 2 years of skepticism, which I will say has been mostly fueled by kind of the mainstream uneducated narrative about Bitcoin. And the more that I learn about it, the more that I realize that Bitcoin is one of the best ideas of all time, and it just fundamentally makes way more sense in reality than the current system of currency that we use. And so I want to preface this with 3 things. First of all, I'm not an expert in Bitcoin. It is one of the deepest rabbit holes I've ever encountered, so I don't even know if I would ever be able to say that I'm an expert. Number 2, I'm not an expert in the current fiat economy. Again, incredibly vast. And number 3, opinions, just my opinions. And they come with some education from different sources, but they're my opinions. I'm just sharing what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about. So about a year ago, year and a half, we launched a podcast for a client. The podcast is called The Block Reward. Our client is one of the, I'd say, foremost thought leaders in Bitcoin, and he's interviewed so many big names in Bitcoin, but also big names from like Wall Street bankers who have left the old system behind and are all in on Bitcoin now. So lots of really cool stories and testimonies. And through editing this podcast and being part of it, I was just sort of exposed to these ideas. And as somebody who has more traditional beliefs around diet and lifestyle and faith and stuff like that, Bitcoin resonated with me, as it does with a lot of people who just don't necessarily fit in with like the mainstream narrative of how the world works. And my fiance and I, we live in 2 countries. So Celine, my fiance, is from Italy and I am from Canada. And living in 2 countries presents a whole bunch of considerations with currency exchanges and local banks and all these things. And so again, that's also kind of pushing me towards like, okay, what is the solution for this? How do I not get taxed and get fees on my money every time I want to transfer it? And I'm at the mercy of the bank for sending an amount of transfer. Like it's my money, but I can't send a certain amount of transfer. I understand that there's things in place for certain reasons, but painful. It's my money and I feel like I don't have control over it half the time. And so I'm going to get into the main things that have turned me into a believer in this. I'm also going to link the podcast that I mentioned below and the host's book, because his book is a really well-rounded opinion on Bitcoin. And yeah, so first of all, the first thing that really, really resonated with me was a fundamental definition of what money is. And bear with me because I'm working through these ideas as we converse here, as I converse with my phone. So what is money? Essentially, money is the way that you store the work that you've done for the future. So thousands of years ago, you would have had to work every single day to collect your firewood, to hunt for your food, to, gather berries and look for shelter and all these things. You would have had to work every single day in order to survive. But what money allows us to do is it allows us to work and then work over the work that we needed to do for that day and actually store the work for the future. And so your bill of money acts as a way to say, here's my work for the future. And so on a day that you are not working, you can go and exchange your stored work, your energy that you've stored in this bill of money. You can go and exchange that for food and for services, goods and services. And so you can survive without working because you have pre-worked, essentially. Also, quick note, if any Bitcoin expert is watching this, criticize the F out of my ideas because I want to refine all these things. And so for you, you have to go out and work to create energy, create money, which you can then use. For the government, on the other hand, they can hit a button that prints the money immediately without doing any work. And so they are creating energy, creating money out of thin air for no work. Whereas you have to go out and, toil in the fields or lay bricks to create that money. And that may not seem like such a big deal, and it didn't for me for the longest time. I thought printing money, oh great, sometimes when the country needs money, we can just print it. But once you start understanding what happens between the relationship between supply and demand, when you increase the supply of something out of thin air, everything else that exists in that supply becomes less demanded and the price of that decreases. And so the value of all the currency becomes less. And so your money that you worked for, that you're storing in the bank, loses 4 or 5% or however much inflation is, loses that every single year because the government is printing money. And so you put in your work, you go out there and do the work, but then the government just pushes a button and makes all your money worth less. And that creates the cycle of constantly needing to make more money and constantly wanting to store your money in things, buying paintings, buying art, buying vehicles, buying anything that, because your money decreases anyways, so why not spend it? And then we get into a culture of consumerism and a culture of materialistic idolization. And so we're just buying stuff all the time because our money's going to deflate anyways or inflate anyways, so why not just buy stuff? And so Bitcoin completely fundamentally reshapes that idea. Because imagine if the farmer, let's say, could just focus on farming, doesn't have to think about investing his money so that he doesn't lose his money all the time, or think about, what happens if the government prints a bunch of money and now my money is worth less than it was before. He gets to just focus on farming and knowing that his Bitcoin is always going to be one Bitcoin. If you measure Bitcoin in fiat currency, it's kind of redundant because if we moved to a Bitcoin standard, then that wouldn't really matter. It would just be the amount of Bitcoin that you owned that mattered. And so the farmer can rest knowing that his one Bitcoin in his bank account tomorrow, the next day, 10 years later, is going to be worth one Bitcoin. Always. Rather than fiat currency where his 100 grand is going to be worth 90 and then 80. And so then he's like, oh, I got to go and make more money. I got to build a bigger farm. I got to make another farm and I got to invest this money. And then that puts him in a state where he has to actually go out and risk his money in order to keep his money staying the same. And so that is something that really resonated with me. And that kind of ties into the second idea. So the first idea is like Bitcoin just works in reality with the way that money and energy works. That idea probably needs refinement. That's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that Bitcoin is 100% finite. Nobody can create Bitcoin. Nobody can print more Bitcoin. The Bitcoin that is out there already exists, which means that your money that you own doesn't decrease over time. It becomes more valuable over time as more people start to use Bitcoin as their form of currency. Because every single Bitcoin that you own is part of a pool of 25 million. And every time that somebody decides to use Bitcoin, the supply of Bitcoin decreases and the demand for it increases, and your money is now worth more. That's why 10 years ago, buying a house with Bitcoin would cost 600 Bitcoin, and today it costs 6 Bitcoin. And is why we can make a pretty fair assumption that in 10 years, buying a house will cost 0.6 Bitcoin. Your money is just worth more over time. The more people that adopt Bitcoin, the more your Bitcoin is worth. And for us, living in 2 countries and then also being in multiple countries in any given year, Bitcoin allows us to take our money with us in the ether without it being controlled or even recognized by different governments. And we don't need to rely on banks in order to get our money to us because our money is ours regardless of where we are. So it's global. It's global and it's borderless. So as we travel and we create this business, we grow this business, having Bitcoin for me is an absolute must. And I think one of the big things that people don't realize is that the fiat currency system is like we abandoned the gold standard like 70 years ago. So we've been testing this for like 70 years and it doesn't seem to be working. The amount of debt is rising to a utter catastrophe of collapse. And our money inflates more and more every year, all the time. And when we look at, okay, like how strong is fiat currency, we can look at examples of another country that also thought that its currency was safe. And it's actually one of the episodes of the podcast that we edit, The Block Reward. One of his guests, I'm going to link the episode below because I don't remember which exact episode it was, but one of his guests was quite a wealthy person in Lebanon. And most of his currency was stored in whatever the Lebanese currency is. And he just imagined that the government was taking proper precautions to make sure that the currency was relatively safe. And within the span of a couple days, his currency devalued by like 99.99% to the point where he couldn't afford food for his family. So one day he's rich, the next day he can't afford food for his family. And we have this idea that something like that can't happen in the West. And maybe there's reasons that I don't know at the moment for why it can't, but I know that many Bitcoin enthusiasts, cryptocurrency enthusiasts believe that that will happen and that that's inevitable and that the inevitability of that is being hidden from us intentionally because there's a lot of people who really, really benefit from the current form of currency, from the control that the powerful have over the currency right now. And according to a lot of the experts who I really respect, people who also used to work in the current financial ecosystem in one way or another, who have now moved to Bitcoin, believe that that a single Bitcoin is going to be worth as much as $100 million. And based on the current price, it seems absolutely insane. When you start thinking about what happens if people lose faith in fiat currency, you start realizing the vast amount of humans that could move to Bitcoin as the alternative. And when that many people, if that many people are to move to Bitcoin, the price will go up to 100 million and beyond, because it is 100% finite. More cannot be created. So each Bitcoin, every single time that somebody buys any piece of Bitcoin, each one is therefore worth more. The more people, the more it's worth. And with the way that things are going in the economy, it's speculated by many experts that people will move to Bitcoin. And when they do, if you own it, your money is now obviously worth a lot more. But at the same time, you own a currency that does not control your perception of how the world works. Because imagine if you could just earn money and put it in your bank account and not use it, and it stayed the same. No, it grew. What am I even saying? It grows. Imagine if your money could be an asset, could be an appreciating asset. And also, that's fundamentally how technology works. Technology is supposed to make things cheaper. As the world improves, as AI and technology expands exponentially in every single direction at once, aren't things supposed to be getting cheaper? Like exponentially cheaper? Didn't we all learn that in like our high school economics class? So why is it that as our society is becoming exponentially more technologically advanced, things are not getting cheaper? Everything is getting more expensive. That is a fundamental contradiction to the reality of how technology works. And it's because fiat is a creation. It's a Frankenstein creation that does not exist within the bounds of reality. It's a way to force the market and force outcomes against the way that it should flow. It's like pushing against the river. And so the argument that's the most compelling for me is that Bitcoin is the best idea, possibly the best idea ever thought up, created. I don't know how to even say that, but is definitely the best idea to ever be introduced to the financial world as we know it. And so, yes, I'm going to continue learning. I'm going to continue researching. As I learn more, I expect to invest larger amounts, but I'm putting a significant amount of my money into Bitcoin. Bitcoin, it's 2024. Bitcoin was introduced in 2009. How many times have we been told that it's going to crash? It's a fad. It's a scam. It doesn't have any place in the future. Here we are, like 15, 16 years later, the price just keeps increasing. Yes, it falls, but then it increases. Again, this idea is not going anywhere. The longer it sticks around, the longer people begin to adopt it. More people who know the current system too. People who have been burned by the current system. So the purpose of this is not to convince you to buy Bitcoin. I don't really care if you do or not. I'm doing it. And it's one of the greatest ideas that I've come across in my life. And as a business owner, I think it's essential to consider. So for what it's worth, those are my ideas about this. Please rip them apart in the comments. Rip them apart, tear them into tiny pieces and light them on fire. I need it. Help me out. Okay. That's everything.